President Cyril Ramaphosa says government will continue prioritizing measures that are aimed at eradicating poverty among the vulnerable members of our society. He says around 60% of the country's budget is currently spent on social wages, which provides various forms of support, basic services and assistance to households and individuals, all of this to combat poverty and hunger. For more on what else came out of the SONA address yesterday, let's bring in Professor Alex van den Heever, who's the chair of the Social Security Systems Administration and Management Studies at Wits University. The Prof joining us via our video link this morning. And it's great to see you, Professor Alex van den Heever. Thanks for your time. I wonder if we can just begin with arguably what the big take was yesterday, and that's the announcement around the Minister of Electricity in the presidency. A game changer or just a gimmick?
Yeah, I'm not so sure it's a game changer because it's not quite clear what exactly the sort of decision-making configuration is there and what they're trying to compensate for. It would have made more sense to streamline structures, but this basically just adds another layer of decision-making to an existing, rather confused layer of decision-making within the system, and it's at the executive level of government. So I think that he's going to have to prove his case. The onus is really on government at this point to actually explain exactly what these measures are meant to achieve and what they're meant to achieve that couldn't be achieved by other and less lesser means, more effective or more efficient alternatives.
Yeah, I mean, but on the face of it, and given the information that is at our disposal, can you kind of in your own head map up where this individual would actually fit into the broader electricity response? Because in many ways, and it's something I've said already before this morning, it feels like there's an overlap of mandates between this minister, the Minister of Energy, the Minister of Public Enterprises, and the CEO at ESCOM.
Yeah, so to a large extent, a member of the executive has a degree of autonomy over their brief, over their mandate. And when you introduce a minister in the presidency as a kind of a further decision maker within that arrangement, it doesn't necessarily improve the ability of the president to direct events, because you've still got ministers with a great degree of autonomy. So there is an issue about what series of decisions are going to be made, because what you'd want to do is kind of now break up the decision making into some sort of coherent structure, so that people can specialize on the things that they can do best. It's not clear that that's happening, and maybe that is the rationale. But this is far from clear, and I'm not sure that changes at the executive level of government were the way to deal with this crisis. There's certainly a lot at the operational level, where a lot of obstructions and political interference exists to basically doing the common sense things, and that's where there is a concern.
Yeah, there's been a lot of concerns, for instance, around to what extent this will help us, for instance, improve the energy availability factor. But you've spoken about this being, something in the presidency and what that might mean for how effective essentially is. It also comes at a time, this announcement, where the president himself is being accused of creating some kind of superpower presidency through the appointments and portfolios that eventually brings under his watch. I mean, it started with state security in his last cabinet reshuffle, and now with this minister in the Minister of Electricity, I beg your pardon. Is that concern valid, do you think? Is that something we should be worried about?
I'm not sure. What it does suggest is that there's a real problem, both within the ANC and within the executive itself, as to whether or not there is a real coherent team there. And if there are some people that are basically pulling away from the wider brief, and this is an attempt to kind of control that. Well, typically a president controls that by appointing the ministers and getting the team that he can work with. What he's doing here is leaving people in place that he can't work with and trying to compensate for that by adding people into the presidency. So I don't think it's creating a super presidency, but I think it's indicative of a problem in how this particular government is working. And in the past, there was an attempt to use the presidency through the state capture process to interfere massively in the state and to profit from it. And that was obviously a serious concern. Here, the issue is potentially many remnants of that former state capture project are within the executive, not being removed, and therefore there's probably a decision-making problem that gets created and a prioritization problem. So I think that what you'd really want at this point is the president to be decisive narrow down the executive, and focus on getting a team that he can work with.
Yeah. Shall we also reflect on the state of disaster that was announced yesterday? I mean, a big part of the concern the morning after is around what this means for procurement processes. The president himself admitting yesterday that the announcement of the state of disaster will enable government to limit regulatory requirements. Already the immediate concern is around the extent to which this will allow for looting. But thereafter, very immediately thereafter, the president also announcing that the Auditor General will be brought in to ensure a continuous monitoring of expenditure. Do you reckon that goes far enough?
It's an unusual configuration because the Auditor General is basically just audits and reviews what is being done. It doesn't prevent it from being done.
Right.
And the removal of the sort of regulatory requirements, for instance, for environmental issues to be taken into consideration, appears to be an attempt to favor the car powership deal, which in itself is deeply problematic and which is sitting in court with strong suggestions of corruption and malfeasance. So this, if that's what's being cleared, if that's the objective of this, to clear the pathway for those car powerships to come in, then it is deeply problematic. But it's also very unclear why they would need the state of disaster in order to create coherent procurement arrangements. For instance, they have not allowed Eskom to purchase diesel at the lowest prices. They're forced to pay high prices charged through PetroSA. Why are they doing that? Government has the complete discretion to alter that particular arrangement without a state of disaster. So that runs down Eskom's budget, and it can't afford the diesel to take a few stages out of the load shedding framework. So why are those things not being done? It never took a state of disaster to introduce tax incentives for sort of rooftop solar, etc., or to introduce deals for the private sector to begin producing. This is only stuff that's happened recently, did not take a state of disaster to arrange. And the problem is these things are very, very obvious measures that should have been in place from about sort of 2010 or earlier. But it's taken up until now to get such simple common sense measures in place. So the problem is the state of disaster should not be used to introduce common sense changes that are fully under the control of government. The question is why they're not just doing them as a normal course of events. And part of the problem there is that Eskom was used as a sort of a protected structure for a lot of patronage. And a large part of that patronage remains in place. There are lots of fingers in that pie. And it appears as though the state of disaster will not be used to impact on that patronage. It may be used to actually ring-fence it while they do other things to try and alleviate the crisis. So they won't get rid of the elephant in the room. They will tiptoe around it, and then they will use a state of disaster which concentrates power in government dangerously to actually do things that they could do ordinarily without that. So I think we have to be very, very skeptical about this move. And it really is a big onus sits on the president to actually explain the logic behind this set of decisions.
If real-time auditing from the Auditor General is not the measure that's going to ensure that there isn't wide-scale looting, as it were, what measure should the president have announced yesterday to give you the confidence that he genuinely wants to ensure that this time around we don't see money being stolen under the guise of us fixing an urgent problem in the country?
Well, the issue would be complete transparency over the procurement process. It's not actually clear what aspects of the procurement process he finds problematic. So it appears as though his emphasis was on environmental requirements, and that doesn't appear to be an appropriate element to remove from the picture. So I think that we would have to have a dedicated design procurement structure which is fully transparent with a lot of public scrutiny of it, so that we can actually see what's going on in real time. But there are many ways to rig bidding processes. But the Auditor General is essentially just auditing, just saying here is an irregular process, which is usually deduced after the fact rather than on a sort of concurrent basis. So there's very often procurement processes are not open to the public. And you only start to see problems when people dispute the results. when people have been excluded from a bidding process on sort of technical grounds, or completely incompetent suppliers have been included on dodgy grounds that should have been excluded. You only start to see that when information on the process actually becomes publicly available. I do not believe that the Auditor General's Office is in any position to do a sort of a concurrent review of all the procurement that would happen around energy in South Africa. It's just not possible. We have to make sure our general systems of governance are working properly. And quite clearly, up until this point, they weren't. And there also seems to be concerns that, in fact, the kind of anti-corruption moves that Director was introducing within Eskom is part of the reason why there was massive pushback against him. So it is a concern. There are systems. Run them properly. They aren't necessarily problematic.
Yeah. And very quickly, Professor van der Heever, yesterday we also heard the President committing to the continuous rolling out of the social relief of distress grant. He says this is to ensure that we're able to insulate the poor in this country from the effects of rising inflation. I mean, does that go far enough when we think about the multiplier effect and the ways through which inflation typically affects everyone?
Yeah, so the social relief of distress grant and its extension, he kind of stopped short of saying it is now a permanent grant, but effectively it is. But we've also been sitting for the last 3 years where it's continuously being classified as temporary. It could never be temporary, and there's a lot of analysis that has been done to show that, in fact, this is enormously positive from a social perspective and also from an economic perspective. So it is absolutely crucial to keep it in place and to build on it. But within our social security framework, there's a lot that's missing. There has to be a deliberation on the wider social security framework that protects income earners as well as people who are in poverty, with overall systems that are not in place. So, for instance, you typically connect things like social grants as well as other aspects of the social protection system to labor activation strategies, etc. You create these links, job reskilling, etc., coupled with income protection. So these are wider, deeper systems. He made no mention of any strategic vision in that direction. And yet any other industrial country in the world, any country that's modern and moving forward, has these frameworks in place. We don't. We have a very, very threadbare social protection framework and its linkage to employment creation. The two go together. You don't do them separately or in silos. Or you don't do just one on its own. You've got to do both. And we don't have the institutions that connect them. This is really an important debate, and we need it fast, and we need a bigger vision than just extending the social relief of distress grant.
Plenty to think about. Thanks for your insights and your thoughts early on this Friday. Professor Alex van der Heever, it's been lovely speaking to you. Professor van der Heever is with Wits University once again. Thanks very much indeed for your time.